Inflation cooled. That was the headline in the middle of July. 3.5%, down from 4.2 the month before, and the biggest one-month drop since the early days of the pandemic. Lower than economists expected. Genuinely good news. And then you went to the grocery store, and the total at the checkout looked exactly like last month's total. Maybe worse. Often, you are not remembering wrong. You are not bad at math. That drop was real. It just did not happen anywhere near your cart. So tonight, let's open that report and go through it line by line and find out who actually made that minus sign. Start with a number everybody quoted. In June, the Consumer Price Index for all items fell 0.4% in a single month. That is the headline. That is what cooled. Now stay in the same report and look one row down. Gasoline fell 9.7% that month. Energy overall fell 5.7%. Those are the numbers doing the work. And now look at the rows that describe the rest of your life. Groceries, what the government calls food at home, went up 0.2%. Shelter went up 0.1%. And core inflation, which strips out food and energy entirely, was flat, or zero. Read those together, and the story changes shape. Prices did not fall in June. One price fell in June, and it fell hard enough to drag the average down with it. Here is why one row can do that. The Consumer Price Index is not a list. It is a weighted average, a basket, and every category inside it has a weight that is supposed to reflect how much of a typical household's money goes there. For 2026, gasoline carries a weight of 2.9%. Household energy, your electricity and gas bill, carries 3.4%. Food carries about 13.5%. And shelter, the biggest single thing in the basket, carries about 36%. So do the rough arithmetic with me. 2.9% of the basket, falling 9.7%, pulls the whole index down by roughly 0.25 percentage point on its own. I want to be careful here, because the official breakdown involves seasonal adjustment and details. I am simplifying, but the scale is right. Most of that minus sign came from one row that holds under 3% of the basket. Meanwhile, the row that holds 36% of it, the roof over your head, went up. And there is one more line in that same report that almost nobody quoted. Gasoline fell 9.7% in June, yes, but compared with a year earlier, gasoline was still 26.7% more expensive. Both of those are true at the same time. The thing that made inflation look better this month is a thing that is still dramatically more expensive than it was last summer. That is not a contradiction. That is just what happens when you compare a month to a month and then compare a year to a year. There is a design decision inside that report worth knowing about because it explains a lot of the gap between the number and your week. You saw that core inflation was flat in June. Core inflation means all items except food and energy. Economists lean on it for a reason that is honestly a good one. Food and energy prices swing violently for reasons that have very little to do with the underlying economy. A drought, a pipeline, a war. If you are trying to work out whether prices in general are speeding up, those swings drown out the signal, so they take them out. But sit with what got taken out. Food and energy, groceries and fuel, the two things you buy most often. The two prices you could recite from memory right now without looking. The number that economists treat as the cleanest read on inflation is the number that deliberately excludes the part of inflation you personally live inside. None of which makes the index a trick. It is a good instrument pointed at a different question. It was built to tell a central bank whether the pace of price increases across an entire economy is accelerating or easing. At that job, it works. It was never built to tell you whether this week was affordable. Now let's talk about why gasoline, of all things, is the one that moves how you feel, because I do not think that is a flaw in you. I think it is the most predictable thing in this entire story. Gasoline is 2.9% of the basket, but it is the only price in your life that somebody prints in numbers 2 feet tall and puts on a pole by the road. You drive past it. You see it again on the way home. You watch it change while you are standing there holding the pump, and it changes in real time to the 1/10 of a cent. Rent is 36% of that basket, and you see it once a month as a transfer with no sign, no billboard, no countdown. Nobody puts your rent on a pole. So gasoline gets a weight in your head that has nothing to do with 2.9%. That is not irrationality. That is what happens when one price is made visible and the others are made invisible. And I am not standing outside this. When gas is cheap, I feel like the month is going to be easier and my rent has not moved a dollar. You can actually see this in the data, which is the part I find remarkable. Consumer sentiment, measured by the University of Michigan, rose from 49.5 in June to 54.4 in the first July reading, highest since February. And the analysis said the improvement was driven mainly by cheaper gasoline across income levels and across political lines. One row of the basket lifted the national mood, but that same survey still sat almost 12% below where it was a year earlier. People felt better and still felt behind, and that combination is the whole subject of this video. And there is one more reason the report can be right while your month is not. That basket describes an average national household. It is not your household. If you drive a lot for work, June really was a cheaper month for you, and the report probably understated your relief. If you take the train, or you work from home, or you do not own a car at all, then that 9.7% discount was never yours to collect. You paid the grocery increase, you paid the shelter increase, and you got none of the fuel decrease. Same report, opposite month. Nobody averaged your life. They averaged everybody's. Because here is the sentence that resolves almost all of it. A falling inflation rate does not mean falling prices. Inflation is a speed. 3.5% means things cost 3.5% more than they did a year ago. When that number drops from 4.2 to 3.5, prices did not come back. They just climb more slowly than they were climbing. The word for prices actually going down across the board is deflation, and that is a genuinely different event that usually shows up with much worse company. Nobody at the Federal Reserve is trying to give you deflation. The stated goal is slow, boring inflation, which means, by design, prices are not scheduled to come back down, ever. And that is the piece that never makes it into the headline. Every one of those yearly increases stacks on top of the last one. Run it forward using the price index, and what $1 bought back in 2020 now takes about $1.29, roughly 29% more. And this year's figures are still being finalized, so treat that as a close estimate rather than a carved number. That is the height you are standing at when you look at the shelf. The report is describing this month's slope. You are looking at 6 years of stacked ground. Both measurements are honest. They are answering different questions. If this feels like a story you have heard before, it is, and the last time is worth 2 minutes. Go back to May of 2015. In that month, the all items index in the United States was completely unchanged from 12 months earlier, 0%. A full year with no measured inflation at all. The reason is sitting right there in the same release. Energy had fallen 16.3% over the year. Gasoline had fallen 25%. The oil price had collapsed. But food in that same 12 months rose 1.6%. Core inflation rose 1.7%. Rent kept rising. So the country got to read the words zero inflation in a year when nobody's rent got cheaper. Same mechanism as this June, 11 years apart. Learn to read it once and you can take apart every inflation headline you will ever see, including the ones that have not happened yet. And notice what the two episodes have in common, because it is not a coincidence. Both times, the row that moved the headline was energy. Energy is the most volatile line in the basket by a wide margin, which means it is very often the line deciding whether a given month's headline reads as relief or as bad news. So when you hear that inflation moved sharply in one single month, energy is the first place to look. Most of the time, that is where you will find it. There is a last thing about that June report, and it is the part I would keep if you only keep one. It describes the past. The Consumer Price Index for June came out in the middle of July, and it measured June's prices. It is a photograph, not a window. The cheap gasoline that made June look better has already turned around. On the day that report landed, the national average for a gallon of regular was about $3.86. By the 21st of July, it was back over $4 as hostilities between the United States and Iran resumed and shipping through the Strait of Hormuz stayed disrupted. Brent crude briefly touched $90 a barrel, and the June report cannot know any of that. The index will not reflect it for another month. I am not going to tell you what happens next, because I do not know, and neither does anybody selling you a prediction. That is not the point. The point is narrower and more useful. The number in the headline is not describing right now. It is describing a month that is already over. So where does that leave you? With two numbers that are both true, and each one keeping to its own job. The price index answers, how fast did prices rise last month? Your card answers, how much more does this cost than the last time I felt okay about it? Those are not competing claims. They were never measuring the same thing, and only one of them was ever about you. Next time a headline tells you inflation cooled, you have 3 questions, and they take about 10 seconds. Which row actually fell? How much of the basket is that row? And is that where my money actually goes? If the answer is gasoline, 2.9%, and not really, then you now know exactly why the report and the receipt disagree. That number is not lying to you. It just is not about you.